When we think of the British Redcoat in North America, our minds instinctively drift to a specific set of images. We see the brick row houses of Boston, the open fields of Lexington Green, or the smoke-choked redoubts of Yorktown. We picture the humid summers of the East Coast, the tricorn hats, and the desperate, losing struggle to hold on to the 13 colonies. We think of a story that ends in 1783 with retreat and defeat. But that is not where the story ends. In fact, for the British Empire, the loss of the American colonies was not an end, but a pivot. It forced the imperial gaze to swing wildly across the globe, searching for new footholds, new markets, and new oceans. Tonight, we are going to travel to a coastline that feels utterly alien to the traditional narrative of the British military in the 18th century. We are leaving the Atlantic behind. We are sailing around the perilous Horn, navigating the vast emptiness of the Pacific, and arriving at a shore defined not by colonial cities, but by towering ancient cedars, impenetrable mists, and mountains that crash directly into the sea. This is the Pacific Northwest in the 1790s, and standing there, amidst the totem poles of the New Charnelth people and the driving rain, are men in the king's uniform. To understand why they are here, we have to understand the psychological state of Britain in 1790. 7 years prior, they had suffered a humiliating amputation of their empire. The United States was gone. France was teetering on the brink of a revolution that would soon consume Europe. The world was unstable. The Royal Navy, the pride of the nation, was looking for a way to reassert its dominance. They found their answer in a place that appeared on most maps as a blank space, or perhaps a rough guess. This was a region shrouded in myth, potentially the hiding place of the fabled Northwest Passage, the shortcut to the riches of the Orient that navigators had died searching for over the last 2 centuries. But there was a problem. A very old, very distinct problem: Spain. For nearly 300 years, the Spanish crown had operated under a geopolitical doctrine known as Mare Clausum, or the Closed Sea. Based on a papal decree from 1493, Spain believed that the entire Pacific Ocean was essentially a private Spanish lake. In their eyes, the western coast of North America, from the jagged tips of Tierra del Fuego all the way to the frozen ice shelves of Alaska, belonged to Madrid. It didn't matter that no Spaniard had ever set foot on most of it. It didn't matter that they had no settlements, no forts, and no presence north of San Francisco. In the mind of the Spanish court, this was their property, and any foreign ship that dipped its hull into these waters was trespassing. So, the stage was set for a collision of titanic proportions. On one side, you have Britain, the wounded lion, hungry for trade and desperate to prove it is still the master of the seas. On the other, you have Spain, the aging global hegemon, terrified of losing its grip on the New World and obsessed with maintaining a monopoly it could no longer enforce. And the flashpoint for this global conflict wasn't a great city or a strategic fortress. It was a small, sheltered inlet on the west coast of what is now Vancouver Island, a place called Nootka Sound. In the late 1780s, this remote harbour became the most important coordinate on the British Admiralty's charts. It was a deep-water anchorage that offered shelter from the brutal Pacific storms. But more importantly, it was inhabited by the New Charnelth people, a sophisticated maritime society that controlled the local resources. And the resource that drew the British here wasn't gold or spices or land for farming. It was something far softer and, in the markets of China, far more valuable. As we peel back the layers of this history, we have to look at the motivations of the men sailing into this fog. They weren't just explorers. They were the vanguard of a new type of imperialism. They were merchant adventurers, backed by the silent, looming threat of the Royal Navy. They were men who looked at the Spanish maps that said, "Keep out," and saw it as an invitation. What happened at Nootka Sound in the summer of 1789 would ripple back to London and Madrid, causing stock markets to panic and fleets to mobilize. It would bring two superpowers to the very brink of a war that would have spanned the globe. And it all started because a few British ships decided to drop anchor in a bay that Spain claimed was forbidden water. This is the story of how the Pacific Northwest almost became the spark for a world war, and how the presence of the British military in this wild frontier reshaped the map of North America forever. To understand the ferocity of this conflict, we have to look closely at the animal that sparked it. It seems absurd to think that empires would clash over a creature as innocuous as the sea otter. But in the late 18th century, the pelt of a sea otter was arguably the most valuable natural commodity on Earth. This was not merely fur. It was a substance of almost magical density. A sea otter has up to 1 million hairs per square inch. It is incredibly soft, waterproof and lustrous. But the British didn't want it for themselves. The climate in London was damp, certainly, but the true market, the voracious, bottomless market that drove men to the ends of the earth, was across the Pacific in Canton. For centuries, the Qing dynasty in China had an insatiable appetite for furs, used to trim the robes of the court mandarins and the wealthy elite during the bitter northern winters. Britain had a massive trade deficit with China. The British public was addicted to tea, and they were paying for it with silver, bleeding the treasury dry. They needed a product the Chinese actually wanted to buy in return. They found it swimming in the kelp forests of the Pacific Northwest. The discovery was almost accidental. A decade earlier, Captain James Cook had passed through these waters. His crew had traded old nails and scrap metal with the indigenous people for these furs, mostly to use as blankets on their bunks. When they arrived in Canton on their way home, they were stunned to discover that these ragged, dirty blankets were selling for astronomical sums. The crew was so overwhelmed by the potential wealth that they nearly mutinied, demanding to turn the ships around and sail back to the northwest coast to fill the hold. They didn't return, but the secret was out. The race was on. By the late 1780s, a chaotic swarm of trading vessels had descended on the coast. These were not the disciplined ships of the Royal Navy. These were merchant adventurers, privateers, and risk-takers. They were men operating on the fringes of the law, sailing under false flags to avoid the monopolies of the East India Company. And the most notorious among them was a former Royal Navy lieutenant named John Meares. Meares is a fascinating character in this drama. He was ambitious, duplicitous, and utterly fearless. He didn't just trade, he set up a base. In 1788, he anchored in Nootka Sound and directed his men to build a small, makeshift trading post. He would later claim he bought the land from the powerful local chief, McQuina, for a pair of pistols. Whether McQuina understood this as a permanent land sale or just a temporary rental is a matter of great historical debate. But to Meares, it was a foothold. He built a small ship, the Northwest America, the first non-indigenous vessel launched in the region. He was planting the British flag in the soil. But while Meares was counting his future fortune, alarms were ringing in Mexico City. The Viceroy of New Spain, the representative of the Spanish king in the Americas, was receiving disturbing intelligence. Russians were creeping down from Alaska. British traders were swarming the coast. The sanctity of the Spanish lake was being violated. The Viceroy decided it was time to slam the door shut. He dispatched a naval officer named Esteban José Martinez to Nootka Sound. Martinez was a man of intense pride and volatile temperament, a veteran who believed fervently in Spain's divine right to the Americas. His orders were clear: assert sovereignty. He was to build a fort, establish a permanent garrison, and gently but firmly turn away any foreigners. He sailed north in the warship Princessa, his cannons loaded, carrying the weight of 3 centuries of imperial tradition. When Martinez arrived at Nootka in the spring of 1789, the mist was heavy on the water. He didn't find an empty wilderness. He found British ships. He found the evidence of Meares's operations. At first, the interactions were tense but polite, a dance of etiquette between officers in the middle of nowhere. There were dinners in captains' cabins and toasts to respective monarchs. But the underlying friction was undeniable. The British traders, led largely by a captain named James Colnett, who had arrived to take over the operation, believed they had every right to be there. They viewed the ocean as open to all nations under the emerging laws of free trade. Martinez viewed them as smugglers and pirates, trespassing in the King of Spain's backyard. The breaking point wasn't a matter of if, but when. You had two different worldviews, anchored a few hundred yards apart in a remote inlet, separated by language, religion, and legal philosophy. The British were there for profit, driven by the aggressive capitalism of the Industrial Revolution. The Spanish were there for honor and territory, driven by the rigid hierarchies of the Old World. The water in Nootka Sound was calm, but the pressure was rising with every tide. The explosion, when it finally came, happened in the claustrophobic confines of a ship's cabin. It was July 1789. The summer fog was thick over Nootka Sound, obscuring the towering fir trees on the shore. Captain James Colnett had just arrived aboard the Argonaut, a British merchant vessel. Colnett was a man of significant, perhaps delusional ambition. He carried papers that he believed gave him the authority to establish a permanent British settlement, to build a fort, and to fly the Union Jack. He saw himself not merely as a trader, but as a colonial governor in waiting. He was unaware that the man waiting for him, Commandant Martinez, considered himself the absolute law in these waters. Colnett boarded Martinez's flagship, the Princessa, expecting a formal reception. He expected to present his credentials, perhaps share a bottle of wine, and then proceed to build his colony. Instead, he walked into an interrogation. The language barrier was thick. Neither man spoke the other's tongue fluently, so the conversation was filtered through interpreters, stripping away nuance and leaving only the raw edges of demand and refusal. Accounts of what happened next vary in the details, but agree on the ferocity. Colnett, frustrated and arrogant, declared his intention to build a fort. Martinez, insulted by the audacity of a foreigner threatening Spanish sovereignty on the deck of a Spanish warship, demanded to see his passport. The argument escalated. Voices were raised. Colnett, a man known for his volatile temper, allegedly placed his hand on his sword. For Martinez, a proud officer of the Spanish Navy, this was the final straw. He didn't see a merchant, he saw an invader. In a moment that would reverberate around the world, Martinez gave the order. Armed Spanish Marines rushed the cabin. Colnett was seized, overpowered, and placed under arrest. It was an act of breathtaking escalation. To arrest a British captain in peacetime, to seize his ship and his crew, was tantamount to a declaration of war. But Martinez didn't stop there. He seized the Argonaut, he seized the Princess Royal, another British ship. The British crews were taken prisoner, stripped of their freedom, and the British flag was hauled down, replaced by the red and gold of Spain. The humiliation was total. The British sailors, men who considered themselves the masters of the ocean, were forced to work under the guns of Spanish soldiers. The Argonaut's cargo, the trade goods intended to buy furs, was confiscated. Even more tragic was the fate of the Chinese artisans Colnett had brought with him. These men, skilled carpenters and smiths, intended to build the new British colony, were captured and put to forced labour, digging fortifications for the very Spanish fort that was now rising to exclude them. They were the silent, forgotten collateral damage of this imperial collision. Colnett himself did not handle the imprisonment well. The shock of the arrest, combined with the ruin of his financial prospects, shattered his mind. He reportedly suffered a mental breakdown while held in the Spanish cabin, at one point attempting to throw himself out of a window into the dark waters of the Sound. It was a chaotic, desperate scene. A British captain raving in madness, his ship stolen, his crew in irons, and the Spanish solidifying their grip on the harbour. Martinez felt justified. He had followed the letter of the law as he understood it. He had defended the integrity of the Spanish Empire against foreign interlopers. He packed the captured British ships and their crews off to the naval base at San Blas in Mexico, confident that his superiors would applaud his decisiveness. He had no way of knowing that he had just lit a fuse that would burn slowly across the Atlantic, all the way to the halls of Westminster. The Pacific is vast, and news in the 18th century travelled at the speed of wind and sail. For months, London knew nothing of the disaster. The city went about its business, the politicians debated budgets, and the Admiralty focused on European affairs. But deep in the hold of a ship making the long, arduous journey back to Europe, a report was being carried. It contained the testimony of the outrage. It detailed the seizure, the imprisonment, the insult to the flag. When that news finally broke, it wouldn't just result in a diplomatic protest. It would trigger a national convulsion. The British public, already feeling the sting of the American loss, would not tolerate another humiliation. They would not tolerate their ships being stolen by Spain. The capture of the Argonaut ceased to be a legal dispute over fur trading rights and transformed into a question of national honour. And for the British Empire, honour was defended with iron and blood. It took months for the full story to travel from the mist-shrouded waters of the Pacific Northwest, around Cape Horn, across the Atlantic, and into the muddy streets of London. But when John Meares arrived in the capital in the spring of 1790, he did not come quietly. He arrived with a dossier, a document known as a memorial, which he presented directly to the House of Commons. Meares was a master of public relations. In his account, the British flag had been trampled, innocent merchants had been shackled, and the Spanish had acted with the barbarity of pirates. He conveniently glossed over his own questionable legal standing and the aggressive posturing of Captain Colmet. To the British public, the details were irrelevant. All they heard was that the Dons had insulted the Crown. The reaction was electric. London's coffee houses buzzed with outrage. Newspapers printed inflammatory cartoons depicting Spanish cruelty. The memory of the American War was still fresh, a dull ache in the national psyche. The loss of the colonies had been a bruise to British pride, and the idea that Spain, a power viewed by the British as decaying, Catholic and tyrannical, could dictate where British ships could sail was intolerable. The cry that went up from the docks to the palace was not for negotiation. It was for war. At the centre of this storm stood William Pitt the Younger. The Prime Minister was a cold, calculating prodigy of politics. He read Meares's report, and where the public saw an insult, Pitt saw an opportunity. He understood the geopolitical chessboard better than anyone in Europe. He knew that the Spanish Empire was overextended, a hollow giant relying on reputation rather than muscle. He realized that the incident at Nootka Sound was the lever he needed to pry open the Pacific Ocean once and for all. If he played this hand correctly, he could smash the doctrine of Mare Clausum and force Spain to acknowledge that the unmapped world was open to British commerce. Pitt went to Parliament and demanded a credit vote of £1 million, a staggering sum to prepare the military. He didn't want a small, punitive expedition. He wanted a sledgehammer. The order went out to the Admiralty, and the machinery of the Royal Navy, dormant since the peace of 1783, groaned back into life. This mobilization became known as the Spanish Armament. In the naval towns of Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Chatham, the scene was one of frenzied industry. Ships of the line, the massive wooden battleships that were the nuclear weapons of their day, were brought out of ordinary. Their hulls were scraped, their masts stepped, and their magazines loaded with tons of black powder and iron shot. The sound of caulking mallets and the creaking of timber filled the air day and night. But ships are useless without men. To crew this massive fleet, the Navy unleashed the press gangs. These feared groups of toughs roamed the streets of coastal towns, dragging merchant sailors, labourers, and anyone who couldn't run fast enough into service. It was a brutal method, but it was effective. Within weeks, thousands of men were forced into the king's service. stripping the merchant fleet of its crews to man the guns of the Royal Navy. The scale of the Spanish armament was terrifying to behold. Over 40 ships of the line were readied for sea. This was a force capable of crushing the Spanish Navy in a single afternoon. It was a message sent in oak and canvas. Britain was ready to burn the world down over Nootka Sound. Across the Channel, the diplomatic cables were burning. Spain, realizing they had kicked a hornet's nest, desperately looked for allies. King Charles IV of Spain invoked the Pacte de Famille, the family compact that bound the Bourbon monarchs of Spain and France together against their common British enemy. In any other decade, this would have meant a general European war. But history had dealt Pitt another ace card. France was paralyzed. The revolution had begun the previous year. The Bastille had fallen, and Louis XVI was a king in name only, held hostage by his own National Assembly. When Spain called for help, the French revolutionaries debated the request and ultimately shrugged. They had no interest in fighting a war for a Spanish king's imperial vanity. Spain was alone, isolated, outgunned, and facing the premier naval power of the age. The British ultimatum was delivered to Madrid with icy politeness. Restore the ships, pay reparations, and admit that the Pacific is free. The choice for Spain was stark. They could fight and lose their empire, or they could swallow their pride and survive. The ships of the Spanish armament sat at Spithead, waiting for the wind and the word. The world held its breath, waiting to see if the first shots of the next great war would be fired over a few hundred otterskins on the edge of the known world. In the opulent palaces of Madrid, the silence from Paris was deafening. Count Floridablanca, the chief minister of Spain, waited for the letter that would promise French battleships to aid his cause. It never came. The Bourbon alliance, the geopolitical bedrock upon which Spanish security had rested for decades, had crumbled under the weight of the French Revolution. Without the French fleet to distract the Royal Navy, Spain was staring down the barrel of a gun held by William Pitt. The realization was bitter. Spain, the empire that had once conquered the Aztecs and the Incas, the empire that had circumnavigated the globe and claimed the oceans as its birthright, was no longer a superpower. It was a hollow shell. Floridablanca knew that if the British fleet sailed, they would not just retake Nootka, they would sweep the Spanish from the Caribbean and perhaps even threaten the silver mines of Mexico. The cost of pride was too high. Spain blinked. On October 28, 1790, the Nootka Convention was signed. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a simple settlement of a trade dispute. Spain agreed to return the captured buildings at Nootka, release the prisoners, and pay reparations to John Mears and the other merchants. But the true significance of the document lay in the fine print. In signing this treaty, Spain was forced to publicly renounce the concept of mare clausum. This was a seismic shift in international law. For centuries, European powers had claimed territory based on the doctrine of discovery. The idea that if you sailed past a coastline and planted a flag, you owned it forever. The Nootka Convention introduced a new, ruthless standard: effective occupation. It established that a nation could only claim sovereignty over land if they actually occupied it, built upon it, and used it. You could no longer hoard the wilderness. If you weren't using it, it was fair game for anyone else. For the British Empire, this was a total victory. They had secured the right for their subjects to trade and settle anywhere on the Pacific coast, not already occupied by Spain. It was an open door to the entire western half of North America. The monopoly was broken. The Pacific Ocean was now a global commons, open to the free trade principles that Britain championed and dominated. But a treaty signed in Europe is just ink on parchment until it is enforced on the ground. The diplomats had done their job. Now it was time for the explorers to finish it. The British Admiralty needed to send a representative to Nootka Sound to formally receive the surrendered territory from the Spanish governor. They needed a man who was equal parts navigator, diplomat, and soldier. They needed someone who could chart this complex coastline once and for all, proving to the world that British science was superior to Spanish secrecy. They chose a man who had learned his trade under the legendary Captain Cook. A stern, meticulous, and tireless officer named George Vancouver. He was given command of the HMS Discovery and the smaller HMS Chatham. His orders were twofold. First, sail to Nootka and act as the Crown's representative in the handover. Second, and perhaps more importantly, he was to survey every inlet, every bay, and every river mouth of the northwest coast. He was to settle the question of the Northwest Passage permanently. As Vancouver prepared his ships in 1791, the mood was very different from the frantic war fever of the previous year. This was a mission of scientific imperialism. The guns were still there, but the primary weapons were sextants, chronometers, and sketchbooks. Vancouver was sailing into a changed world. The Nootka crisis had cleared the board of the old Spanish pieces. Now, the game was about who could map the territory fastest and most accurately. The Redcoats were coming back to the Pacific, not as invaders, but as surveyors. Men who would draw the lines that would eventually become the borders of nations. When HMS Discovery finally pierced the fogbank of Nootka Sound in August 1792, Captain George Vancouver was braced for hostility. He had read the reports of the Spanish seizure of British ships. He knew the history of violence in this harbour. He expected to find a fortress bristling with cannon and a Spanish commander eager to obstruct his mission. He had prepared his mind for a fight. Instead, he found a dinner party. The man waiting for him was Don Juan Francisco de la Bodega y Cuadra. If the Pacific Northwest was a wild, rough frontier, Cuadra was a slice of high European aristocracy transplanted into the wilderness. He was a seasoned naval officer, a Peruvian-born criollo of immense charm, generosity, and sophistication. Where Martinez had met the British with muskets and irons, Cuadra met them with fresh bread, vegetables, and an open table. The relationship that developed between these two men is one of the most remarkable and unexpected chapters in the history of imperial rivalry. They were technically adversaries sent by their respective kings to argue over the ownership of a continent. Yet, in the damp, rain-soaked isolation of Friendly Cove, they forged a genuine bond. They dined on each other's ships almost nightly. They shared maps and charts, state secrets in any other context, comparing their surveys of the coastline. The Spanish officers attended British church services. The British officers attended Spanish fiestas. For a brief, shining moment, Nootka Sound became a surreal outpost of civility, where the Enlightenment ideals of scientific cooperation trumped national chauvinism. But beneath the silver candlelight and the toast to King George and King Charles, a hard diplomatic battle was being fought. The Nootka Convention had been written by lawyers in Madrid and London who had never seen the Pacific coast. The language was vague. It stipulated that Spain must return the buildings and tracts of land seized from Mears. Cuadra, a shrewd negotiator, interpreted this strictly. He had conducted his own investigation with the local indigenous people. McQuinna, the New Charnelth chief, had told him that Mears had only ever built a small, temporary hut on a tiny patch of beach. Therefore, Cuadra argued with a smile, Spain would happily return exactly that, the few square yards of dirt where the hut had stood. The rest of the Sound and the continent remained Spanish. Vancouver was cornered. His orders were to accept the restitution of the territory, implying the entire harbour. If he accepted Cuadra's tiny plot of land, he would be admitting that Britain's claim was illegitimate. He was a man of rigid duty, and he could not bend. Day after day, they met to negotiate. Letters were exchanged, drafted with agonizing politeness, yet refusing to yield an inch. Cuadra offered the small beach. Vancouver demanded the whole port. It was an impasse, but it was a stalemate handled with such grace that it became legendary. Realizing they could not solve the riddle without starting a war neither man wanted, they agreed to disagree. They would refer the matter back to their respective governments in Europe and wait for further instructions. In a final gesture of mutual respect, they agreed to name the great landmass they had been sailing around. They christened it the Island of Quadra and Vancouver. It was a dual name for a dual claim. Over time, history has erased the Spaniards' name from the maps, leaving only Vancouver Island, a forgetting that mirrors the eventual fate of the Spanish Empire in this region. As Quadra prepared to sail south to Mexico, leaving the issue unresolved, the moment marked the high tide of Spain in the Pacific Northwest. They would never again command such presence or respect in these waters. And for Vancouver, the diplomatic failure was a liberation. Freed from the haggling at Nootka, he could turn his attention to his true passion, the survey. He turned the discovery away from the politics of the Sound and into the labyrinth of the Salish Sea. He was about to undertake one of the greatest feats of navigation in maritime history, tracing thousands of miles of complex coastline to prove, once and for all, that the easy road to Europe was a myth. With the diplomatic pageantry of Nootka behind him, Captain Vancouver turned his eyes to the real enemy, the coastline itself. He was about to embark on a mission of obsessive, grinding detail that would break his health but secure his immortality. The British Admiralty had sent him to find the truth, and for the next 3 summers, that is exactly what he did. The popular image of exploration involves great ships sailing gallantly into new harbours. The reality for Vancouver's men was far more brutal. The coast of the Pacific Northwest is a fractured chaos of islands, fjords, and inlets. The deep-draft Discovery could not safely navigate these narrow, rock-strewn channels. So the work fell to the small boats, the pinnaces, cutters, and yawls. These were open rowing boats, exposed to the elements, powered by the muscles of the sailors. Day after day, week after week, the crews would leave the comfort of the mothership. They would row for miles into the unknown, tracing every twist of the shoreline, every dead-end inlet, seeking the elusive river that might lead back to the Atlantic. They slept in the open, soaked by the relentless rain, surviving on hardtack and portable soup, constantly wary of the currents and the complex relations with the indigenous peoples they encountered. Vancouver, a man who demanded perfection, drove them relentlessly. He was suffering from a thyroid condition that made him irritable and erratic, but his discipline never wavered. He famously stated that he would not leave the coast until he had traced every navigable mile of the continental shore. This was not just cartography, it was an act of possession. By naming the landscape, Vancouver was claiming it for the British Crown. He plastered the map with the names of his friends, his patrons, and his heroes. Puget Sound, Mount Rainier, Mount Baker, Burrard Inlet. Even the enemy was honoured, as seen in the Strait of Georgia or the Spanish Banks. He was writing the biography of the British establishment onto the geography of North America. But the most significant discovery of Vancouver's voyage was a negative one. For 2 centuries, Europe had dreamed of the Strait of Anian, a wide, easy waterway that would cut through the continent and link Europe to Asia. It was a fantasy that had driven economies and launched 1,000 ships. Vancouver killed that fantasy. By tracing the coast all the way to Alaska, he proved definitively that no such passage existed in the temperate latitudes. There was no shortcut. The continent was a solid, formidable barrier. This realization was crushing for the Romantics, but it was invaluable for the Empire. It shifted the focus of British interest from a mythical transit route to the tangible resources of the land itself. Vancouver's charts were masterpieces of accuracy. They were so precise that they remained the standard for navigation well into the 19th century. While the diplomats in London and Madrid argued over abstract rights, Vancouver's men were creating the facts on the ground, or rather, on the paper. In the 18th century, a map was a weapon. By defining the coastline with such scientific rigor, Britain was asserting a type of intellectual ownership that was harder to dispute than any planted flag. The Spanish had been there first, but the British had known it best. By 1794, the geopolitical storm had passed. The final act of the Nootka crisis played out not with a bang, but with a quiet ceremony. A third Nootka Convention had been signed in Europe. Spain and Britain agreed to mutually abandon Nootka Sound. It was a face-saving measure for both sides. The Spanish flag was lowered, the British flag was raised and then lowered, and the settlement was dismantled. The land was returned to the indigenous people, who likely wondered what the last 5 years of European madness had been about. But the silence that fell over Nootka Sound was deceptive. The Redcoats and the Royal Navy ships sailed away, never to return in force, but they had left the door wide open. The Spanish monopoly was dead. The Spanish lake was drained. The Nootka crisis had ensured that the Pacific Northwest would not be a closed province of New Spain, like California or Mexico. It was now an international zone, open to the strongest competitor. And the competitors came. They didn't wear red coats. They wore the rough-spun clothes of American traders, the Boston men. Empowered by the British victory over the Spanish monopoly, American ships flooded the coast, dominating the fur trade that Britain had fought to open. They were followed by the overland explorers Lewis and Clark and the fur brigades of the British Hudson's Bay Company. The what-if of this story is staggering. If Britain had not challenged Spain in 1790, if Pitt had blinked, if the Royal Navy had not mobilized, the history of the North American West would look radically different. The Spanish claim to the entire coast up to Alaska might have solidified. The United States, expanding westward, might have hit a Spanish wall at the Rockies instead of an open frontier. The states of Washington, Oregon, and the province of British Columbia might today be Spanish-speaking territories, or perhaps independent nations born from the fragmentation of the Spanish Empire. Instead, the Nootka crisis created a vacuum that Britain and America would eventually fill. It set the stage for the Oregon Treaty of 1846, which drew the border at the 49th parallel, a line that exists because the British Empire pushed the Spanish Empire out of the way 50 years earlier. The Redcoats of the 1790s are the ghosts of the Pacific Northwest. They didn't fight a battle there. They didn't leave behind great stone fortresses or colonial cities. Their physical trace is almost non-existent, but their legacy is everywhere. It is in the names on the maps. It is in the borders of the nations. And it is in the very fact that the Pacific coast today is part of the English-speaking world. The Nootka crisis was the war that never happened, but it was the victory that shaped a continent. History is rarely decided by the inevitable. Often, it hangs on a single decision made by a captain in a remote harbour or a politician in a distant capital. The Nootka crisis is the ultimate reminder that the map we know today was never guaranteed. If you enjoyed this expedition into the forgotten corners of the Redcoat era, please leave a like to help this video navigate the YouTube algorithm. And I want to hear from you in the comments below. If the Spanish armament had sailed and Britain and Spain had gone to war in 1790, who do you think would have come out on top? Would we be looking at a British California today? Let me know your theories. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into military history. Until then, keep the history alive.